So I'm really excited to be here tonight to talk to y'all about drones. It's my favorite topic. And if you read the little write-up that came out of the description, I like to say sometimes that drones are the Rodney Dangerfields of the bee world. They get no respect. When you are a new beekeeper, what you might have learned about drones is that they are the male bees and that they have only one job, and that's to mate with other queens, and that they don't contribute in a discernible way to the survival of the colony. You might have been told that drones are freeloaders and a drain on your colony's resources. However, if you dig a little deeper, I hope you'll find that drones are fascinating, integral to colony, and I hope you'll learn to better appreciate these little black sheep. So I'm sure y'all all know this. In a typical colony in the spring when it's booming, you'll probably have one queen, about 60,000 workers, and maybe 2,000 to 6,000 drones, depending on your setup. And most drones only live about 22 to 32 days, and few drones get to be old men. So yeah, I think they kind of look like this to the workers. Before we talk about drones specifically, let's back up to some colony basics. In order to survive, a colony must be queen right, they must have lots of workers, and they must have food stores in order to survive winter. And these things are the bare minimum for survival of a single colony, but what about the colony as a superorganism? A superorganism is when there are individual organisms that have specialized behavior that together create one organism. The honeybee superorganism is the colony. So if you think about humans, we need food, shelter, and water to survive as individuals. But as a species, we need to reproduce to ensure survival. In a similar way, in order for the colonies, the superorganism to reproduce, they need drones. In the superorganism model, drones are considered the flying testes, and I could have drawn that differently and I didn't, and you're welcome. So in order for bees to reproduce on the colony level, the worker honeybees must raise drones. They have this biological drive to raise drones and to be drone right. You often hear about colonies being queen right. Well, it's just as important that they be drone right. But colonies won't raise drones if they can't afford them. In weak, struggling colonies, the workers will cull the drone eggs and larvae. So it's really a sign of prosperity if a colony can raise drones. If we indulge in some anthropomorphizing, you can think of it like the workers having trophy husbands, like they can boast about how many drones that they can support, because really they're not going to support them if they can't afford it. So let's begin at the beginning. With drones, life begins with a proper cell. Drones are larger and they need a bigger crib. Every time a queen lays an egg, she first puts her head into the cell and she feels around with her front legs to see how big the cell is. Then she pulls her head out, turns around, inserts her abdomen, and she lays an egg. If she felt that the cell was small, like 4.5 to maybe 5.5 millimeters, she will lay a worker egg, which means that she releases an egg from her oviduct, and as it passes down by the valve fold, some sperm is released from her spermatheca, and this fertilized egg goes out the sting chamber and is deposited in the back of a cell. But if she feels with those front legs that the cell is larger, around 6 millimeters, the spermatheca or larger, the spermatheca doesn't release any sperm, the egg isn't fertilized, and it becomes a drone. Think for a minute about how fascinating that is, that by just feeling in the cell with her front legs, the queen's body knows not to release sperm when the egg is being deposited. It's just mind-boggling. And researchers figured this out by clipping the front legs off of queens. The queens with clipped off front legs didn't put the appropriate eggs in the cells. They would lay workers or drones willy-nilly. So that's how we know. I'm sure the queens did not enjoy that. So drones come from an unfertilized egg. They don't have fathers. They only have one set of chromosomes. And this is true of all Hymenoptera, all bees and wasps. They're called haploids. Haploids have one set of chromosomes. Workers and queens are diploid, and they have two sets of chromosomes. There is such a thing as a diploid drone. It's not terribly common, and it's a result of inbreeding. And these individuals have poor genetics, and they don't make it to maturity in real life, but raised in a lab, when they raise them, they're much smaller than normal drones, and they're sterile. So what happens is the larva of diploid drones gives off a specific odor from their cuticle that signals to the nurse bees that something is amiss, and the workers eat the diploid drone larva. Nothing is wasted, it's protein. What beekeepers see when this happens is this shotgun brood pattern on the right. And we know that this colony needs a new queen, right? The drones that you'll see in your hives are all haploids, and because they only have one set of chromosomes, you'll occasionally see some recessive genes expressed. The dominant eye color in honeybees, as y'all know, is black, but occasionally you'll see white-eyed drones, like on the right, or this range of beige to cherry-colored eyes on the left, which is kind of cool to see. Okay, so we have haploid drone eggs and larger cells. And when you're first learning about bees, you're taught that all larvae are fed royal jelly for the first few days, right? Well, it's a tad more complex than that. Workers actually feed, the nurse bees actually feed the 3 different larvae 3 different jellies and are fed in different amounts: queen jelly, worker jelly, and drone jelly. And like the diet of worker larvae, the drone's diet changes the last few days when they're fed less jelly and more pollen and honey, so more carbs and different vitamins and amino acids. The big difference, though, is in the amount of food the drone larvae get. They are bigger bees and they need more food, not unlike teenage humans. So drones are fed more, they're much bigger than the workers, and they need some extra time to grow into adults. And y'all are probably familiar with this chart where we know that everybody's an egg for 3 days. Workers are larvae for around 5 days, 5 to 6, queens for 4, and drones for 7 or 8. Next is a pupal stage where, again, the drones need more time to develop. And the total time from egg to adult for workers is 21, queens is 16, and drones is 23. Now, these numbers are important to know, but they are not set in stone. There are 2 factors that weigh heavily on the developmental times. If the temperature in the brood nest is too low, or if the larvae don't get enough food, then the larval and pupal times can be much longer. So for drones, it can take up to 28 days. Workers, it can take up to 24, and queens 17. And again, it has to do with temperature and food. So studies show that the larval and pupal survival rates are much higher for workers than drones, and it probably has to do with the location of the drone cells in the nest. So we talked about how the drones are raised in larger cells, and how does this work? If bees make their own comb, so if you put a frame in and it's empty, and don't supply any foundation, they're amazing little architects. And what they'll do is create smaller cells in the center, and that's where they raise their workers. And then they'll create larger cells around the periphery and in the bottom, and that's where they raise drones. And then, of course, they store their pollen and their honey up in the corners. And if you think about how remember the priority of the colony is that workers are more, the queen's most important, then the workers and the drones. So if you think about temperature and food, well, who's going to get more visits by the dining cart, right? It's the workers in the middle. Do you ever sit out? Remember when we used to go to restaurants and you got stuck in the corner, you didn't get your coffee refilled as often. So the workers get more attention from the nurse bees. And then the drones on the outside too, when it comes to temperature, if there's a cold snap, what happens? The drones are going to be chilled before the workers. So even in their infancy, the drones are serving the workers by providing insulation, which I think is pretty cool. So if you do use foundation, what you'll see is the workers are desperate to raise their drones, so they'll typically put them around the bottom, hang from the bottom of the frames. And again, they're not going to get as much food, and they're not going to be quite as warm. So here's some actual drone cells at the top and on the side. This is on a medium frame. You see the worker brood in the middle, and you can see those drone cells are kind of puffy. They look a little bit like bubble wrap. So drone rearing typically happens during a nectar flow, but at all times the colony is constantly evaluating where to put resources. If they're raising a lot of brood, drone or worker, and conditions change, let's say there's a cold snap or it gets rainy and windy and the food stops coming in, then the workers will curb the amount of brood they're raising by eating eggs, larvae, and even uncapping and pulling out pupa. There's a term for this cannibalism, and it's called brood trimming. So workers trim the brood by eating it. And sometimes in a small colony, there just aren't enough workers to raise all the eggs a queen lays. So the workers will trim the brood. It's astonishing to me to consider all the feedback loops that are going on in a colony at any given time. Like, how does one worker know which brood to cull, and how does she know what her sisters are doing? but somehow it all works out. It's just fascinating though. Okay, so adult drones emerge fully formed with all the equipment they need for their job, but they're still developing in the first week or two after emergence and are not quite ready to mate. So for the first 24 hours, their cuticles hardening. For the first week, they can't feed themselves. Isn't that adorable? So they beg for food from nurse bees. And then after a week, they can feed themselves. They typically just eat the regurgitated contents of the nurse bees' stomachs, but once they feed themselves, they just drink from honey cells, and that's all they need. They just need carbs. Then for the first 12 days, their reproductive organs are developing. They have everything they need, but they're still developing and maturing. And then days 6 through 9, they start their first orientation and cleansing flights. And from days 12 to 18, they can have their first attempts at mating flights. So drones have one job, and very few of the drones that are raised in a colony are going to get to fulfill their ultimate destiny, and that is to mate with queens from other colonies. So let's look at how drones are equipped for their one job and how they are different from workers. So compared to workers, drones are lacking in many ways. They have tiny mandibles because they don't need to be chewing or manipulating any structures in the colony. They just need to be able to uncap honey cells. But their mandibles do produce orientation pheromones. They have a short proboscis. It's 3 millimeters and workers is 6. They don't have pollen collecting structures on their legs. They have a slender crop because they don't need that extra honey stomach because they're not bringing back nectar. And they don't have wax, hypopharyngeal, or nasomouth glands. And they don't have a sting gland, which makes them a lot of fun to work with. Now let's look at how they are equipped for their one job. Their antennae have 10 times the olfactory plates of workers. They have to be able to smell the queen, up in the sky. And so they can have this incredible sense of smell. They have much larger compound eyes. They have a lot more facets than the workers' eyes. The optic lobes of their brain is much larger to process all that information coming in from those big eyes. They have broader wings, and they have larger flight muscles to propel those wings. So, do you know what is on this slide? It is bees mating in the sky. And you can't see anything because it's impossible to see with the naked eye. Honeybees are unique in their mating behavior. They mate on the wing or while they're flying, about 12 miles an hour. And because of this, it's been much more difficult to study. In fact, for a long time, people think that because the drone's reproductive organs are internal and they couldn't see them mating, they thought that maybe bees didn't mate at all. It wasn't until researchers figured out how to attach a kite to a queen so they could better track her and film it that they were really able to understand what was going on. So we know that honeybees mate in special areas called drone congregation areas, or DCAs. And DCAs are areas about 30 to 200 meters in diameter, where drones from many different colonies gather together and fly around looking for queens to mate with. While they're flying around, their air in the DCA is being flooded with the drone's mandibular pheromones, which helps other drones and queens to find the DCAs. Drones from one colony will visit different DCAs at the same time, and any individual drone will visit several DCAs in the same day, sort of like bar hopping. And drones can fly for about 30 minutes before they need to go back home and refuel, depending on how far they're going and how hot it is outside. So drones need to leave the nest to go on mating flights in the afternoon from maybe 1 to 4, 3 to 7, depending on which book they read. Actually, in warmer climates like where I am, it's later. I've seen them flying in DCAs at 7 o'clock at night, but in more temperate areas, it can be earlier. So these DCAs are a mystery because they remain constant year after year. There's supposedly a DCA in Sheffield, England that has been said to have consistently had drones in it since 1722. Isn't that crazy? Now, y'all know, I'm sure, that almost all the drones die out in the fall, so there's no intergenerational learning. So how do the drones know where these mysterious spots are? It really is a mystery. There are some things that people have observed about DCAs, and there's some clues to where they are. One is that they are frequently a depression in the landscape. So if the bees head out, they look for a lower spot. Then there are sometimes visual cues like tree lines or rivers or a highway that they might use to fly along. There's often a windbreak, so there'll be an open area with a bank of trees or a parking lot with buildings that provide a windbreak. It's much easier to mate if it's not in strong wind. And there's also a possibility that DCAs happen where there are magnetic anomalies in the earth. All honeybees have iron particles in their abdomens, and we know that workers will use magnetism as one of their tools to orient. So this is definitely a possibility. So the pathways that drones use to travel to and from various DCAs are called flyways. On the right is a map of DCAs and flyways in Arizona from a study done by Gerald Lober, who's on the call tonight, using radar. So the dots are the DCAs, and then the lines and the dashes are the flyways that connect the DCAs. And if you could see this in better detail, you'd see that the flight paths align with roadways and tree lines, and often the DCAs occur in intersections. However, there are also DCAs over forested areas and water that don't really have any visual cues. So there's just a lot we don't know about DCAs. So drones fly around the DCAs, and once they spot and smell a queen, they gather in the comet-like formations and chase the virgin queen. And the strongest, fastest drones reach her and mate while they're still in the air, flying about 12 to 15 miles an hour. Now, given the opportunity, bees will mate in the flyways, but we know that inbreeding is not good for honeybees, and so the mating process has several really interesting checks in place to discourage inbreeding. When workers and queens leave the nest, they fly up about 8 meters and then they head on their way. But when drones leave the hive, they head up about 26 meters and head on their way. And then when they find a DCA, they will continue flying upwards of 75 meters off above the ground. Now, drones prefer to go to DCAs close to home. Now, remember, most of them are not going to be successful, and they're going to have to go back home and refuel. They only have about 30 minutes to fly. So they prefer closer to home so they can keep going back to get honey. Whereas a queen, if she makes it to a DCA, there are going to be hundreds, if not thousands of drones, plenty of drones for her to mate with. So she can afford the extra flying time to fly farther away. So queens are going to fly lower, and they're going to fly farther away before they head up to look for a DCA, where the drones are going to prefer close to home and they're going to be flying up high. So their flight paths are separated from their brothers, which isn't that cool? I think it's just absolutely fascinating the way evolution works. Okay, so honeybee copulation is a complicated thing. And already we've seen that it's done mid-flight, on the go. So a queen has found a DCA, and because of her strong pheromones, she soon attracts a comet of drones chasing her. And the closest drone to her is going to approach her from below. And once contact is made, it takes just a few seconds, literally a few seconds, for mating to happen. Inside the drone's barrel-shaped abdomen, his endophallus is folded up inside. And in order to mate, he must mount the queen. He grabs her with his first 2 pairs of legs. At this point, in order to be successful, the queen has to open her sting chamber. And not all drones who get this far are successful. I like to point out that bees figured out consent long before humans did. So if she doesn't open her sting chamber, he doesn't mate. But when she does, he grabs her with all 6 legs. He everts his endophallus into the queen's open sting chamber. And this action flips him backward, and ejaculation happens because of the pressure of the drone's hemolymph as his abdomen contracts. And he's paralyzed. The bulb of his endophallus stays in the queen, ripped from his body, and he falls to the ground and dies. And then, again, this whole thing takes only a couple seconds and often has an audible pop sound that you can sometimes be heard from the ground. Now the work of the drone is done, and the queen will mate with many more drones on that day. Sometimes you'll hear that they mate with 20 drones, but it can be as many as 50. And from those matings, she'll have enough sperm more than enough to spill her spermatheca, which has enzymes in it that keep the semen viable for several years. And this multiple mating is really important for a colony to be genetically diverse and strong. If the queen only mates with a couple drones, the colony probably will not survive long. About 70% of the time, the queen will return to the nest with the bulb of the last endophallus still in her sting chamber. And we call this the mating sign. And you can see this bright orange color which is noticeable to us, but apparently with the drone's ability to see ultraviolet colors, it's even more vivid to them, which might help them when they're lining up to mate. So drones that don't get lucky and die will fly around for half an hour, come back, drink some honey, set back out again, groom himself a little bit, maybe go to several different DCAs in an afternoon. But if mating doesn't kill him, the workers eventually will. If resources are scarce and a dearth, workers will refuse them entrance back into the hive. And they're constantly assessing the needs and resources of the colony in some magical way. And sometimes they can't afford drones, like I mentioned earlier, if they hit a dearth or hit a rough spot, and they just will refuse them. But by the fall, and certainly in the winter months, the workers will get rid of any remaining drones because they are a drain on resources, and it's all about the survival of the colony. So they will kick them out. And there are typically no old drones in a hive. Whenever I do this talk, someone will come up to me and say, I've seen a few drones in the winter, and so occasionally there are some, but for the most part, they're all gone by the winter. So how do you find drone congregation areas? The way that it has been done for a long time is to use a weather balloon. So this is, and this method takes two people really, because one person, this is my buddy Courtney, she's got a kite string and here's a weather balloon and there's some queen pheromone lure hanging from it. And I'm standing back here with the camera, but also with the binoculars. And this is the first time we went out looking for DCAs. It was a beautiful still day. It was the afternoon. And I kind of scouted out a few places in my neighborhood. This is a soccer field that's lined by trees, like textbook DCA, open area with trees. And we walked around for a really long time and did not see a single insect. And then we went to a parking lot with a that was lined by buildings, and we went to another neighbor's yard that had like a little bowl area, and we didn't find a single thing. It was very hot and very disappointing. People also sometimes will hold a pole up instead of the balloon with queen pheromone and do the same thing. But this method is, it takes a lot of time. It takes two people. And helium is, if y'all don't know, there's a helium shortage. So it's very expensive. It's much more expensive than it used to be. And it can be hard to get. So I started trying to figure out another method to look for drone congregation areas. And then as Jerry mentioned, I ended up buying a this kind of mechanical drone, which just to make things clear, when I say drones, I'm talking about these fellas. And when I say UAV, I'm talking about this mechanical kind of drone, short for unmanned aerial vehicle. So what I've got here is, this is my UAV, and I'm using some really thin sewing thread that's tied these 2 feet across these 2 feet, and it hangs down. And this is my lure hanging down here. And the queen pheromone can be hard to come by. So, but this works really great. This is this product called Temp Queen that you can get from all the bee equipment suppliers. And it's artificial queen mandibular pheromone, which is the QMP is the sex attractant for drones. And this works great. It's these little neon green tubes, and they're just a few dollars each. You can keep them in the freezer, and they last for quite a while, actually. And so you want to tie the QMP to something to give it some weight. And I found that these hair rollers, these plastic hair rollers, work great. The air can kind of flow through them. So what you do is you just cut off this fuzzy stuff from the outside, and then you attach the pheromone with a little zip tie. And then this is the string around it. I added a little bit of weight to the bottom. I found that about 7 or 8 grams is like a really good weight. And I use this is some jewelry hardware to attach it on, just because I'm doing it a lot, but you don't have to do that. You can just tie it on with some thread. So you attach it to the UAV, and you start flying around, and you can see this is a close-up shot from the UAV camera of some drones around the pheromones. Very exciting to see. And the next slide, this is a movie, and I hope y'all can see it. You never know with Zoom. But this is a glorious view of the drones flying around in the drone congregation area. And notice under these bees, it's a lot of trees. So this is not necessarily an open field. And this DCA is actually just like 1 or 2 lots over from that soccer field, which should be the textbook DCA. But I've flown in that soccer field many times and not gotten a single nibble. But this DCA is always well populated. So I find this interesting that it's not necessarily the open field. It's frequently over trees, the ones that I have found. So last year, after figuring out how to use UAV to find the DCAs, I created this citizen science website. It's called mapmydca.com. And on this website, there are pages with general information about drones, about DCAs, about finding DCAs, and I outline the method that in a little bit more detail. I just told you about using the hair roller and the temp queen. And then on the home screen, you can click on View the DCA Map. So anyone can register and post or pin DCAs when they find them. So if you click on View the Map, you'll see these pins. I've zoomed in here on the ones in the Atlanta area. And if you roll over one of the pins, this little menu comes up. And when you click on Details, you can see the information that the person uploaded, including dates, time, temperatures. I kind of put in any question I thought someone might be interested in. And when you scroll down, there's a field to upload if people want YouTube videos of this flight. And all the ones that I've pinned, I've uploaded videos. So if you're interested in seeing some DCAs, you can go to the map and watch them. Now, my hope is that people will go out and have a good excuse to buy UAV and find DCAs in their area and upload them to this map. And I hope, because there's so much we don't know about DCAs, I figure just getting data will help for future research and help us understand this mysterious bee behavior. So there are, if you don't want to go buy a DCA, a drone yourself, I'm breaking my rule. If you don't want to go buy a UAV yourself, you can also reach out to other UAV pilots. I mean, people love these things and they get really enthusiastic about it and they want excuses to fly them. So maybe you know someone or somebody's kid who has one and they might want to go on this little adventure with you. The one thing that I don't talk about on my website is how to fly a UAV. You really need to educate yourself. This is a complicated piece of equipment and it can be dangerous if you flew over a road and it crashed, you could cause a car accident. So what you want to do is educate yourself and learn how to safely be a UAV pilot. And also you should know that it's not illegal for you to fly your UAV over private property so long as you yourself are not standing. You're not trespassing, your UAV can be flying. But you want to be careful and aware, and you always want to be courteous to people. So I'm going to tell you a story about, I was flying mine not that far from my house, and I was in a cul-de-sac, and I was finishing up, but this guy pulls up in a pickup truck, and he was like, "What are you doing?" He was clearly not very happy to see me flying my UAV over his house, and I was like, "Oh, I'm doing something for honeybee research, but I can leave. I'm pretty much done. I don't want to offend you." And he was like, "What do you mean bees?" So he kind of picked my brain a little bit. And as people will do, he's like, "Well, I know a beekeeper." And I was like, "Yeah, who is it? Maybe I know them. You never know." And he said, "Oh, no, you don't know her. She lives up in Cumming. Her name's Kelly, and I know her from kayaking." And I said, "Oh, Kelly Campbell. Yeah, I know her." And he was like, "Oh, okay." And he ended up asking me to take a picture of his house and email it to him. So I thought that we kind of parted on good terms. But before I'd even gotten home, I got this text from my friend Kelly, and it was a screenshot from this guy where he wrote, "Some bee lady was flying drone over a house today saying she was looking for male honeybees zooming over my treetops. WTF. She said she knew you, so I figured she had to be cool, so I didn't shoot her." So now I live in Georgia. People in Georgia love their guns, but all to say, you just always want to be courteous and careful because you never know when you might be offending someone when you're flying your UAV. But you tell them you're doing it with bees and they usually warm up.
Hey, Julia, 5 minutes, please.
Okay, perfect. Doing great. So what's next? Some other projects that I have planned. Actually, we were going to do this last spring with the Georgia Tech Urban Honeybee Project. We got this RFID tagging equipment, and we were raising drones in an incubator, and we were going to tag them with these RFID chips. and then monitor each drone when it comes and goes. So we got some hard data on how, how old they were when they first took flights, how long their flights were, and I was pretty excited about it. And we got the drones, the green drone cone in the colonies, and then COVID happened and they shut down all the research. So hopefully this spring we can get that going, because I think that will be really interesting. And also I really wanted to create a trap that could be towed by the UAV so that we could catch drones and not have to use the helium balloon. So an issue with towing anything with UAV is weight. And so I was pretty proud of myself, thought about this. I was using foam core to make these circles to provide structure. And these are, fiberglass fishing poles. And I was trying this sort of like sock style, thinking I could, with an opening here, they could scoop the bees up. However, I was very disappointed that it really didn't work. The bees kind of flew out, and I think it was pointed out to me that these circles, with the sun behind them, create a distraction that is just too hard for the bees. So I scrapped that, and I've been corresponding with a very generous Jerry Loper, who's just an amazing person and so generous with his incredible knowledge. And he actually shipped me one of his old drone traps. So that's what I have on here, just the old cone kind. And however, even with this, what happens is the bees are always interested in the UAV. Now they'll be flying down here around the trap, just like they were on this one. You see them down here, but there's always a contingent that's sort of bombarding the UAV. And it seems like defensive behavior to me. I really don't know. I'd like to figure out how to study that, if anybody has any ideas. But unfortunately, even with the trap that works better, it took me 4 entire batteries and 2 hours to capture like 5 drones. So it just wasn't effective. And with a helium balloon, I could catch like 150 drones in an hour. So it just didn't work out. But I'd like to look at that again. If anybody has any ideas, I'd love to hear them. And I have made it to, this is the end of my talk, and this is my contact information. I really would like to get this DCA map filled out. I've had a lot of people register from all over, from countries everywhere in many, many states. However, not that many people have penned the DCA. So if I could speak to your club, I'd be happy to get my contact information down, and happy to answer questions.
Hey, thank you very much, Julia. Just for your information, we were up to 382 people. We're at
Wow.
a 373 at the moment. So I see, and I should mention that Gerald Loper, I think he's listening to this program. And Gerald, if you are listening, we have made it so if you have a microphone or a camera, you could turn yourself on and you can actually talk to us. But Gerald Loper, as some of us are fortunate enough to know, really pioneered a lot of this work with drone congregation areas, the use of these helium balloons, using a radar to plot them and so on. And so we're honored tonight to have the longtime expert in drones and drone flights and congregation areas and so on participating along with us in this. So Dewey, it's your turn. You got about 10-15 minutes to ask your questions, and then we'll move on to Melanie.
Okay. Can you hear me, Julia?
Yep.
All righty. We got 17 questions, but some will probably be pretty quick answer. Some of them you kind of covered. They were asked before you got to them. I'll start with the first one, which is good luck on that. Probably going to be a tough one. A question from Tom in Arizona. Why pay for special queens when all my drones are mutts?
Well, that's maybe a question for Melanie. I'm not really sure what that means. Is that why pay? Okay. I don't know, but I think there's a lot to be said for locally sourced genetics. And I personally let my hives requeen themselves all the time. But yeah, I mean, that's definitely a factor. And again, that might be a good question for Melanie, but the genetics, half the equation is the drones that queen mates with. And there's nothing more important than a well-mated queen, and that is going to depend on your drones. So that's one of the reasons why it's important for people to. I have cut this talk down a little bit, but one of the things I took out is I encourage people to let their colonies have their drones. You know, people like to cut out drone brood, but it's really important to let them raise drones. And you know, you're giving back to the bee population that's in your area, and that's going to help you as a beekeeper. But it's super easy. You don't even have to buy the green drone frames. You can just, if you use foundation, just pop the foundation out of one frame and put it in the brood nest between two frames of brood, and they will lickety split, especially in the spring, draw out drone size cells and raise drones. They're so desperate for it. Or you can take a shallow or medium frame and put it in your deep, and they'll do the same thing. They'll draw drone comb underneath it and raise a whole slew of drones. So I do encourage people to let their colonies have their drones.
Okay, that's a tough one to try to answer. Got a comment from Wolfgang. Great slide design, Julia. You want to say anything about your slides? They were great.
I'm a graphic artist by training. I've been doing that even longer than I've been keeping bees. So thank you. I appreciate that. I try to keep it entertaining.
Virginia Allen asked, for the first part, you're talking the biology. What is the main difference of contents in a royal jelly for the drones? She asked the question, higher amino acids?
Ooh, good question. I think it's mostly, it has a little bit to do with the proportion of the white fraction and the clear fraction. I can't remember off the top of my head what the proportion is, but the biggest difference is really in quantity. They get more, but that's a good question. I'll have to go look that up.
Another Anthony asked from New York in terms of drones. Oh my thing switched. Where are we, Anthony? Here. He'd asked in terms of stability of colonies. Is there certain number of drones needed in a hive for hive stability? IPM mite controls call for culling of drone brood.
Mm-hmm. Well, so Tom Seeley's done studies, and what he found is what drones, the percentage of drone that colonies will raise if you leave them to their own devices is 13 to 17%. So you know, around 15% is what they want. And of course, you know, mites are an issue because we know that the mites love that drone comb. And in fact, a lot of people use drone brood culling as a mite control method because we know they're going to jump in there, especially in the spring. So they put in the drone comb and then take them out and freeze them. But I kind of joke with people that, because people know in my club that I'm into drones. And when I talk about drone culling, they say, well, how could you do that and let them kill their drones? But I know how beekeepers are, and they'll forget to pull the comb out. And so they end up just raising drones. So but yeah, I mean, it is an issue. It's still, you know, I still think that colonies need their drones. They want to be drone right. And, you know, controlling your mites is kind of another issue, but it is something that what I do tell people if they're going to do the drone culling to, when they pull them out, you know, open up a bunch of the cells and pull them out. And if they're riddled with mites, okay, you know, freeze it. And if they're not, let the bees have them.
Okay, we had a bunch of questions related to the DCAs. So we'll have the next few are related to that. Mark asked, how far from the hive is your typical DCA?
Good question, Mark. So it really depends on the density of colonies in the area. And maybe Gerald Loper should answer this one, but you know, if there are a lot of, and I live in Atlanta, there are a lot of beekeepers. And so there, you know, there's some really close to my apiary. But it just depends on the density. If there aren't that many and they're farther out, then they will fly farther. But they can be as close as, you know, 100 meters. But drones will fly. You know, they can fly a couple miles if they need to, but they really prefer to be closer. There's not really any number. It just kind of depends on the area, really.
And Kathy, somewhat related, are there DCAs close to each other, or how far apart is one DCA from another?
That's a really good question. If that, I would go back to that slide, that paper that Mr. Loper wrote again, where there's a map that they mapped out with radar, which is fascinating because they could see everything. from my experience, it's hard because I can't fly like over every square inch. So I've kind of found them in a different way. So I'm sure in my neighborhood I'm missing some, but they're pretty close together. I mean, they can be close together. So if you remember that map that I showed, it was like can't remember the measurement, but it's almost like they go on a circuit, so they can fly out on a flyway. And I've heard some people speculate that, like they fly on the flyway, they hit a DCA, and they'll fly up, up to 75 meters high, and then they'll fly back down, and they might go to the next DCA and fly up. So they sort of do a little bit of a circuit. So yes, they are. They can be really close together, sort of on a path, and sometimes a few DCAs that are more separate, like later in the season when they aren't as populous, in the spring almost become like one giant DCA. And I do have one DCA where I monitor the bees. There's one sort of down the creek, not that far. Can't tell you the exact measurement, but I feel like, and then when I was back in the spring, I found them in August. And when I was back in the spring, when I would fly, it was just one big DCA because there were just so many drones flooding the area. What's interesting is you'll fly, you know that you've left a DCA because the bees you would think that they would keep chasing the lure or queen, but they really don't. Only a handful will keep going once you get kind of beyond the boundaries of a DCA, which is a fascinating thing because you would think, well, if they really want to mate, they'd keep going after the queen, but they don't, which is really interesting.
Sort of like down on Peachtree, the male's checking out the bars, going one to the next to the next.
Bar hopping, yeah.
Jeffrey is asking, when the queen flies to a DCA to mate, does she take a retinue of some type, or is it a solo flight?
Nope, she is on her own. It's a solo flight. The workers will often, and Melanie can speak to this better than I can probably, but they'll bite and cajole her to get her out the front door, and then they'll be waiting there for her. Sometimes they're fanning the Nasonoff glands, but they'll wait for her return. So she goes. It's a solo flight.
And kind of related, when the queen flying so far away from her hive on her mating flight, how many don't make it back?
That I don't know. I have no idea.
Yeah.
Yeah, they just they get eaten by birds. Things can happen, bad weather, and they sometimes will go on more than one mating flight, but it's usually all completed within a couple days.
Kara wanted to know from a successful mating, does the endophilus fall out by itself, so she's receptive to the next drone, or does the next drone pull it out?
That's a great question, and I've read conflicting things, but there's this part of the endophallus is this complicated structure, and there's a part called the fimbriate lobe that looks like a little petal, and it fills with hemolymph. So some people think it's got like the hair on it. Some people think that the next drone coming in, that structure helps pull it out, but it definitely comes out when the next drone is going in. And then the bulb has sticky stuff on it. What's the word? Mucus, and that evolutionarily that might have like kind of plugged it up and kept the semen in, and that's what you see in the mating sign coming back. But that's, like I said, the mating sign, they say, is there about 70% of the time. So sometimes it does fall out while she's flying.
Okay, there's some more on DCAs, but there's a couple that are related to the UAV. So I thought maybe we could skip to a couple of those. Paul wanted to know, what is your model of your UAV? What's the model?
I am using what is it called? I'm sorry, I'm blanking out. I haven't looked at that thing in a while. It's a, if I think of it, I'll type it in the chat. How's that?
Oh, okay, that'd be great.
It's a fairly good one. I would like to, my goal last year was to try to find some less expensive ones so I could tell people, well, this is a good model. You don't have to spend a fortune. And I ordered a $50 one from Amazon, and it had a remote, but it didn't have a camera on it. And I learned that you really need to have the camera on it. What it did was it recorded the video, but you would have to bring it back and look at it. And that's really not going to help you. So I would say, you definitely want one that has either your phone or that the camera shows you in real time what it sees. I think that's sort of the defining line about the the quality of the UAV.
Jeffrey Jarvis is saying, was it a DJI?
DJI, thank you. It's a DJI.
DJI then, yeah.
Phantom Pro, a DJI Phantom Pro.
Phantom Pro. Okay, thank you. Scott in Montana want to know, have you filmed the DCAs with your UAV without the artificial pheromone so you can see actual matings? I think that would be then with a queen itself, with a virgin queen.
Well, okay, so I have flown in the DCAs without pheromone, just really to kind of test out that defensive behavior that I was talking about, to see if they combat it so much. And they don't attack it like they do when there's pheromone in the area. But if there's pheromone in the area, they will chase anything. They'll chase a butterfly or a fly, or anything that moves. They'll form those comets. So it's just kind of having that stimulus. So when you fly through without one, it's interesting because you don't see them lining up and trailing each other as much. I did fly with a virgin once, and this is, I don't know if I mentioned that I like to use thin thread in case it gets caught on something, it tears, and then you don't crash your UAV, you just lose your lure, which is no big deal. But I made a little cage that tried to make it really tiny and put a virgin in it. And it was the one time that my string got caught on a tree branch, and that poor queen got stuck up in that tree, and I felt so bad. So, but she was in a cage. I just kind of wanted to see the efficacy of using a virgin versus the temp queen. But I have not. I know people have like super glued queens to some wire and towed it so that they could, and I have not done that.
Yeah, Norm Gary was able to do that. We would throw rocks through them, and the drones would follow rocks.
Yep.
Little stones. Why are you trying to capture drones anyway? Talking with showing your nettings.
Yeah, so I was doing a capture, mark, and recapture study last spring. So I marked drones and red in one DCA, and then another one about 3/4 of a mile away, I marked them with yellow paint. And I kind of alerted all the beekeepers in the area that I knew and asked them if they saw painted drones. And I did catch a red drone and the yellow DCA, so I know that the drones were frequenting both. And it was a little bit interesting because they had to cross a major highway to get between the two. And then I was able to see which colonies they came from the people. Of course, my colonies, I saw both because I was in there all the time and I was looking for them. The other beekeepers a couple of them reported that they saw some yellow drones, but they, you know how people are. You don't know it was a 3-week period, so they had to be in there during that time. But it was interesting. So that's what I was doing then, and I might do another study this spring, a little bit different, where I mark all the drones in certain colonies, like try to mark all of them, and then try to capture in the DCA and see what the ratio is, because that should tell me something about how many colonies are in the area. So,
Okay, excuse me, but I think we need to wrap this up so we can move on to our next speaker.
Okay. There's one other comment that James is posted, and perhaps it's relative to all of this as well. James is saying licensing is not required for recreational use of the UAVs he's talking about, but the drone, the UAV, does need to be registered. Be very careful of local restrictions on use.
yes, you have to do that, and you have to. There's an app that you can get where you have to register your flights. You just do it right when you're flying, but it's important in case there's military coming through or something. You want to be responsible, so definitely follow all your local rules and regulations and be a good citizen, so that we'll be able to keep flying our UAVs.
Okay, there's some others in there that are still there that we'll try to get Julia to look at, or someone else we could try to answer for you. Thank you for your patience. Sorry that we did not get to all of them. I'd just like to close and saying great comments, Julia. Very informative. Thank you.
Thanks.
Yes.
Thanks so much for having me. I really enjoyed it.